between 1948 and 1970, and you need to go right the way up to 1970 for obvious reasons, because that's when the Iranian mass immigration came out, when the mullahs came to power. Almost 900,000 people, Jews obviously, fled or were expelled from Muslim countries. Now bear that in mind, because it becomes very important that we have to differentiate between countries in a moment. The last major immigration was from Iran, as I said before, and thereafter there were individual sort of escapes from these kind of countries. I remember I was in the army with a youngster who had walked, literally walked from Damascus to the border, and through the night somehow he'd got into Israel, and he was one of the last young Syrian Jews to become Israeli. And that was in 1974, right? So there you go. So it was right the way through and right up to the 80s. Okay. Now, the other thing we need to do is you need to distinguish between the North African Aliyot and the Middle Eastern Aliyot, because they are different. And as I said before, there were over 800,000, closer to 900,000, no one's exactly sure, of Jews who lived in the Arab world. Now, in the Arab world, in the North African region, means these four countries by and large. I mean, there were more countries, but these are the countries I'm going to focus on: Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Yemen. No, I'm reading them because you can see them, right? Because that's where there were fairly large Jewish populations. Now, I'm going to start with Morocco because Morocco not only had one of the largest populations, but also Morocco now, as you would have seen in the news in the last, I probably should have put it up in the update, signed a military agreement. It's actually an arms agreement. They talk about a military agreement with Israel. Israel is now supplying arms to Morocco, serious arms, like drones and, all the sophisticated stuff. So we're going to start with Morocco, and you say Morocco is a really, really interesting example of a Jewish community that flourished and then didn't flourish. So in June 1948, right, you can see why June. The state's established in May 1948. The first of the riots and the anti-Jewish or the anti-Semitic riots, right, in Uja and Jira, I don't pronounce these things, but these are riots against the state by and large, right? And Jew equals Israel, therefore you are going to be killed. Between 1948 and 1949, that first year, 18,000 left the country for Israel. That's all, right? They were encouraged to leave all the way through the 1950s. I'm going to come back to that slide in a minute. King Mohammed V, he was the king at the time. He allowed Jewish immigration. Now, Jews were still there, right? They were still citizens, but Israel existed. He didn't want the Jews to be there. So what happened between 1961 and 1964 was Operation Yachi, where the Mossad, and it was really the Mossad, organized secret immigration, and close to 97,000, right, within 3 years, a huge amount, left secretly, by the way. Okay, it wasn't, come to the airport and hop on a thing. So they went via France and Italy. There were people like going on holiday to France, right? They would leave from Casablanca or from Tangier, right? As if they're going then onto Israel. But 97,000, remember, this is the 1960s, the early 1960s, right? Population is not huge in Israel. So they coming in, and I'm going to go back to this slide here. Just bear with me a second. The last one now, I don't know why that slide slipped in there. This last bullet point. The Moroccan Jews were always perceived as being positive contributors to Israeli society, as opposed to many of the other Sepharidi Aliyot, which were discriminated against, looked down upon. And remember, the leadership at the moment in Israel is Ben Gurion and the white Ashkenazi old men through the 50s. Moshe Sharet, Ben Gurion, Golda Meir. And they suddenly seeing these analphabetim, as they were called, illiterate, because they were illiterate as far as the white Ashkenazi old men were concerned. They couldn't read Hebrew, but they were very, very well-read, those that came from the cities. Then there were the others who came from villages, who had never seen a flush toilet before. They had never lived in apartment blocks. They would make a fire in the middle of the sitting room, and the Israelis would go berserk. What have we brought here? So the Moroccans weren't perceived in that same light, although I'm going to be careful here not to generalize, right? Because I remember when I was in the army, there was a garin of Moroccan youngsters who were really looked down upon until they proved how good they were, and suddenly everyone changed their attitude. But by and large, the Moroccan Aliyah was perceived as a very, very positive one. Whereas those coming from Algeria, and we're going to look at Algeria now because Algeria is a good example of a very educated minority being forced to leave. First of all, it's related and absolutely connected to the end of French colonial rule in Algeria. Right, everyone's seen The Day of the Jackal. We spoke about before when movies, become this docudrama. It wasn't a docudrama, but the whole idea of of assassinating de Gaulle because he wasn't going to give them independence. But initially, and almost entirely, most of the Jews from Algeria went to France when it became independent in 1962. Why? Because of this bullet point. And this is for David particularly. In 1963, the Algerians passed a law called the Nationality Code, which excluded all non-Muslims from citizenship. What does that sound like? He said and left a silence to be thought about. That's the law of return upside down, the wrong way round. If you weren't a Muslim, you couldn't be an Algerian citizen automatically. There were all kinds of things that had to go. If you had money, obviously you bought, doesn't matter. But the attempts to encourage mass immigration to Israel didn't succeed. And the overwhelming majority, have a look at this number. There were 140,000 Jews, Algerian Jews, who had French citizenship. Remember, Algeria was a colony of France. So you had French citizenship. The same way, if you were Australian in the 1950s or South African in the 1950s, no, South Africa was already a republic, it wasn't a republic, 60 was a republic. In the 50s, you had British citizenship because it was a colony. Of the 140,000, a minute number went to Israel. Why? Because France was a hell of a lot more attractive in the 50s. And Jonathan can give us an example of what it was like growing up in a tzena, right? When you were on rations and you never saw fruit or eggs. So why go to Israel where this country can, might not even survive, never mind live like I lived in Algeria, in the upper middle class. I'll go to France. And that's why France today, by the way, not only do the Jews go to France, but a lot of the Algerian non-Jewish French Algerians went to France. And in Paris today, you've got a serious problem of North African minorities who were discriminated against. And who do they turn against? I don't have to go into that. So that was Algeria, very different from Morocco. And then the next one becomes even stranger because Tunisia had a fairly large population, 105,000. There are about 1,500 that are still there today because Tunisia didn't really become anti-Semitic until it became anti-Zionist after the Six-Day War. The Six-Day War did, and we'll talk about that when we go on as well, but the Six-Day War was also a turning point. Much more than 48, by the way, in the sense of the way governments relate. But that's also debatable because 850,000 people were turfed out of Muslim countries in 48, but in 67, it became different. Anyway, so there are about 1,500 there. Tunisia became independent from France in 1956. And then 67 saw this sort of anti-Jewish policies. They were passing anti-Semitic laws, basically, right? And the Jews there, those who were smart enough, saw the writing on the wall, and about half of them went to Israel, as opposed to the Algerians who went to France. So that's the North African part. Okay, I chose those 4 countries because each one of them has a different tone to it, a different style to it, a different emphasis to it. But these are all people coming from Muslim countries. And the one country I want to talk about tonight from the Middle East, because these are the 4 we're going to look at, there's only going to be time for one really, and that's Iraq. Because Iraq is a particularly problematic country as far as the Jews are concerned, right? Why? Because first of all, Iraq is where Babylon was. There had been Jewish presence in Babylon from the days when the temple was around. Okay? And in fact, in Israel, the Iraqi descendants or people who've got their roots in Iraq are known as Bavlim, from Babylon, originally from Bavel. Okay? But in the 1930s, the Nazis had huge influence in what was then Baghdad. It wasn't Iraq then. Husseini, right, who was very anti-Semitic, who was the main mullah in Jerusalem. He hung out from time to time in Iraq. And Mein Kampf was translated into Arabic and published in Iraqi newspapers. Now, there was a seed there of serious anti-Semitism. And kids were taught in schools, Jews, money, drinking blood of babies for Pesach, the protocols of the elders of Zion, and those kind of horrendous stories were prevalent right the way through. And of course, 1948 saw a huge wave of anti-Semitism. In the same way that when the Nazis came to power, and what they did as far as the Jews were concerned before the final solution, what did they do? Jews were removed from their government jobs. So if you were a teacher in Iraq, you lost your job. The same as you were a teacher in the 30s in Berlin, or any government job, doctors, lawyers, whatever. But there was pressure from all over the world, right, to let the Jews go. So they reversed their policy about allowing Jews to go, and they allowed Jews to emigrate, and that's when Operation Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, Ezra and Nehemiah, does anyone know who they were? Okay, you're on mute, I'll tell you. They were the two prophets who led, who led the Jews out of Babylon back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. So it's an interesting, again, it's the Mossad, obviously, right? And they lifted all but 6,000. There were about 130,000, I think, all in all. We'll come to that in a minute. And they went to Israel via Cyprus. Right? Again, the same kind of story. You're allowed to leave. They flew the planes in, similar to this Ethiopian exodus, by the way, which hasn't been enough in time. We'll get to that when we get to that 2 weeks down the road. But similar kind of thing. Just by the way, you know that the record for the number of people ever been on a Boeing 747. Does anybody know this? The number of people on a Boeing 747 is held by an Israeli El Al plane that flew 1,100 people out of Ethiopia. Also, they took all the seats out. Everything was literally ripped out the plane, and people sat on the floor. And they flew them from Ethiopia, from Addis Ababa to Israel. That's the record number of people ever flown out on a 747. You can look it up if you don't believe it. Anyway, so between 1950 and 1952, about 130,000 were airlifted to Israel. And here is the big crunch, and why I wanted to talk about this, and why I'm going to go into more detail. The number of descendants of Iraqi Jews now in Israel, or living in Israel, descendants living in Israel, is this: almost 500,000. Now, if you stop and think for a minute, and this always is what blows my mind, to coin a phrase. When you talk about the Holocaust and you talk about 6 million, never mind the big number of 6 million. Stop at the number of 1 million kids, and how many Jews there would be in the world today if those 1 million kids hadn't been murdered. He says in this silence. Revert back to the Iraqi Jews, right? So the Iraqi Jews, now the Sepharidi Mizrahi community, was said when we come to the other 3 countries in a moment, not a moment, next week, we're not going to have time to do it. They, first of all, were settled in what's called Ma'abarot. A Ma'abara was a refugee camp by and large, right? But unlike the UNRWA refugee camps that are kept as refugee camps and people are kept in tents and fed once a day with, donations that come from the world, that only keeps it going, these Ma'abarot were turned into towns. The unfortunate thing about this whole thing was they were settled in what's called the periphery, the peripheral areas of Israel. Dimona, Kiryat Shmone, Sderot. These are names that you obviously know about, right? And Jonathan can fill us in. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes just to talk about them, because I'm sure you would have visited one or two in your day. And the problem with these Ma'abarot were they were almost kept separate. And they didn't develop at the rate that they should have developed. And they didn't have the resources poured into them that they should have had. And as a result, the discrimination felt by Iraqi Jews, for example, was huge. And where was it directed? It was directed in 1977 in the election against the Labour Party, against what people would have expected to be its natural ally, the Labour movement. Who did they vote for? In mass, Menachem Begin, a white Ashkenazi old man who understood right from the beginning, because Menachem Begin, as opposed to Benjamin Netanyahu and the others in the Likud party today, was a liberal. He really, really was. I didn't like him. That's a different story for his politics. But in terms of the kind of person that he was, he understood what this discrimination was about. Although he was part of it, by the way, through the 40s and the 50s. That's what people forget as well. That's what makes it so absurd. Right? He was part of Etzel. I mean, he was, he was as much part of the creation of the state as anybody else. The fact that he was in opposition is irrelevant. But he read very quickly the mood of the discrimination that this Aliyah particularly felt. Okay, so I'm going to open, we've got 5 minutes now, brilliant, good timing. I'm going to open this up